Psalm 139. This is another favorite psalm. I'm sure that many of you are very familiar with the words of this psalm. We're going to read it, or I'm going to read it slowly. It's 24 verses, but I believe that it just so much sense to get the full picture of what's going on with this psalm. Again, we're having David, King David, in a different moment of his life from Psalm 19. But we'll see how life and the growing in life and the growing hand on hand with the Lord brings all sorts of richness into somebody's life. So if you have it there, you can read with me, starting at verse 1. 139. 9. And I'm reading from the New International Version. You kind of hear me, yes? Yes. Okay. You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, but even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. For you created me. You created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I awake, I am still with you. If only you, God, would slay the wicked. Away from me, you who are bloodthirsty. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord, and abhor those who are in rebellion against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. I've given the title, it could be called as the phrase in the psalm that catches my attention, my imagination, too wonderful for me. And I think it's too wonderful in so many ways. And it's, as I say, is a familiar psalm that comes in the point of King David's life when We find a very close fellowship and knowledge of each other. Well, obviously, God knows him utterly, and to his utmost. But then, at this point in his life, it seems to be that David has got to a point of understanding God in a different way, if you like, in a mature way. He's had fellowship with God. It is the God who made him. He knows that. He expresses that in the psalm. But he's also the God that called him. And he can probably remember that day when he was about 16 years of age, and he was in the fields looking after the sheep, and after going through all the brothers, the prophet Samuel was still looking for the one that was to be anointed. And the wee boy was called home because the prophet wanted to see him, and he was anointed as king of Israel right and there. His calling. He knows also now a fellowship with a God that has walked with him, has guided him throughout many years of his life. And he knows that it is the God that has also through all those years protected him. And who is the David that is speaking at this moment in time? This is the experience. The voice is the experience. Is the voice of this psalm, where more than 48 times he's using the word I, me, my, because it's intimate. Out of his heart, out of his soul, he's pouring out on these pages. And he's talking to God in the second person. This is a close conversation. And is David the shepherd boy on the one hand, but is also David the king, David the servant of King Saul when he was a musician, and he was called in to be a poet to King Saul. So building in your head the picture of who is this David that is coming before God in this psalm. Is David the one that had to run away from Saul as well? Because Saul got it against him and tried to kill him a few times and hated him, and he had to run away. But it's also David the warrior, David that faced Goliath, and then in time he became the leader of the hosts of Israel. But it's also David, as I had mentioned before, the anointed boy that eventually knew he was going to become king, even though he was serving Saul. But it's also, as we found out in last Psalm, Psalm 19, but particularly Psalm 51, that is the one that points at the moment in his life when he was aware of terrible sin in his life. So this is David the sinner also. But then it's David, as we read in Psalm 19, and we read in so many other places in the Psalms and in the stories about David that talk about the law lover, because he loved the word of God. But it's also David the worshipper, David the one that when the Ark of Covenant was finally rescued and it was coming back into the holy place, into the temple, he didn't mind what people thought, and he just danced on the streets as the presence of God was returning into the temple. This is David the worshipper, but this is also David the man that understands what pain really is like when his son Absalom betrayed him, and he had to run away because his son self-proclaimed king and made a faction, and he had to flee in order not to confront his son, and knew what was to lose a son. in a tragic accident because of the consequences of this enmity. This is David, the one that knew that and knew what pain felt like. And he was also, by this stage, David the husband, but then also probably David the lover, the one that could not restrain himself when he saw Bathsheba. And all of this is what's behind this David. And there's 4 parts to this, where I've divided this psalm in 4 parts, neatly every 6 verses. So we go from verses 1 to 6, and David will talk to us about God's omniscience, the all-seeing God. So those verses will speak very clearly of and explain how he understands that God is everywhere. Verses 7 to 12, God's omnipresence, the all-present, the I am. He speaks of the everlasting, the ever-present God. Then the next 6 verses is about God's the omnipotence of God, the all-creator. And he goes through those beautiful verses that are probably some of the most popular verses that describe how a child becomes a human being, and how he grows and how he's looked after by God's creation. And then ultimately he finishes with a view on God, the holy God, the if you could call it, I don't know whether this word exists, but the omnipurity of God, of the all holy. So the psalm is a personal letter that it could perfectly be, and I hope that we can identify with it at some point with our lives. The psalm is no doubt a great blessing and encouragement to any Christian, to any of us. It's an exhortation for any Christian today. So God omniscient, 1 to 6, the all-seeing. God knows everything about me. How difficult do you think you are? We often, it's difficult. I can be very awkward. How difficult do you think you can be? Do you think your spouses, your children know you well? They can sometimes almost anticipate how are you going to react. How well do you know yourself? But God knows you better than that. God knows you deeper than that. He knows your needs. He knows your flaws. He knows everything about you and about every single person that exists. Not only he knows everything we do, but he also understands everything we think. What provokes that thinking? What's the feelings and emotions behind that thinking? He knows our thoughts even before they come to our minds. Jesus, and when he's talking about prayer and he's trying to teach prayer to his disciples, he says, your Father knows everything, every thought, even before you bring it to him. Whether we are rising, in verse 3, the 3 actions are in that verse, and whether we are rising, whether we are walking, whether we are sitting. You remember Psalm 1 talked about that process of movement. He knows every moment. Before a word is spoken, he's already heard it. And that brings us to, Matthew 12, 36 and 37 that speaks about us being very careful with what we say, because our words can come back and condemn us. So words, in the context of the Jewish world, words are very important. You don't just say things for saying things. You know that saying, or the we in the church and in Christian circles, your word never returns empty. And this is Jewish thought, where your words had power to curse or to bless. And whatever those words are sent, the intention that our words are sent with, is likely to come back. And if it is a blessing, you're likely to be blessed back in life. But if you curse, you're likely to suffer the consequences of that as well. So, yes, he knows our words, and because of that, we also need to be aware of how we use our words. James has a whole chapter about the power of the tongue. So it is important not to lose sight of that. The Lord's hand is with us, and he lays his hand in our future, but he also still has his hand on our past. And the Lord is present, and David understood and knew that. Future, past, and present, they are all alike to the Lord, because he created time, but because, as I was saying before, he is. He is the I am. He is the ever-present. It's not that he takes a trip into the future. This is kind of a kind of Star Trekky sort of thinking, sometimes hard to understand. But it is not that he moves across time. No, he is ever present at every moment of history. He is. And we need to understand that he is always. As Isaiah refers to this kind of thinking in 55 verse 9, and he says, as higher are the heavens from the earth, so much higher are my thoughts from your thoughts. So try to understand that, and you'll give yourself a hard time, because it's beyond us. So we can rejoice in the assurance that God has foreordained our lives, the efforts of our life, and we cannot comprehend that, but neither can we fall off away from his care and his presence and his reach. And this is what David understands. God is omnipresent in his life. He is the all-present versus, the first part is the omniscience of God. He knows everything. Second part, the omnipresence, the all-present. God sees everything around me. Can I hide from him? Can you hide? Have you ever tried to hide from God? Have you ever been, and I have come across a couple of people just recently that are so angry with God that their way of hiding from God is shutting down and being angry with God. But God knows that anger. God knows that feeling. He still is the I am. So David discovers the impossibility of going away from God, from escaping from his presence. Should I go to, you'll be there. Should I hide in the darkness? No, because your darkness will disappear before you, because you are light. One can never be hidden from God's all-seeing eye, not even in the darkness. After all, God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. Nothing, Hebrews 4:13 reminds us, is nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Then he goes, verses 13 18, God's omnipotence, the all-creative, the all-creating God. Last Psalm talked a little bit about this, about creation. There are so many Psalms about creation because if you remember from last week, there were the three revelations. The revelation of creation speaks of God. Then there is the revelation of the Word of God given to Israel, the law. And then ultimately, David does point ahead at redemption, at the ultimate, at God's final revelation word, Christ Himself. God has revealed Himself through creation, and perhaps the human body is the focus in this psalm. How wonderful is the human body? Every single cell in our bodies has all the information necessary to make one of you again. Science keeps on thinking that they are going to harness that, and they're going to produce or reproduce or something that. I don't know. They're still trying at it. I'm not sure whether they'll ever get at it, but who thought of this first? God Himself. And not only has every cell in your body has all the information to pass on to make another one of you, no, it's also able to continue that chain of information without being broken and being passed on through generations. Do you actually know that in 7 years, the entire cell group of your body would have renewed? So the cells that you have now are not the same cells in your body that you had over 7 years ago. It's like it's a new you. An update. Every 7 years, your cells are updating themselves. It's a pity that the world is kind of broken, and then we then seem to multiply and pass on the same crappy information that illness and all of that is made. So we keep on passing that. But just think of the marvel of what the human body is capable of doing. And then also just looking into the picture, the wonderful picture that David is putting in there on this human being that is being formed, that is being nurtured without any science, anything to go with it. It's just is made to create this human being completely perfect in every sense, all the organs, everything together, just to be formed in it's a miracle. And David zooms in that in relation to his own process of understanding how precious he is understanding that he is in the hands of Almighty God. Now, that phrase that he uses, wonderfully made or differently made, is really more the sense of the word. Distinctly made. Because we are not copies of each other. Just look around the room. We're all different. We all look different. And we are capable of producing even more creative difference in our designs. And God just took joy in being creative. And He's made us distinctly from each other. But not only that, He can, and this is David's point, distinctly love us as us. Not like, I don't need to become like somebody else. I don't need to be anything else. He loves me and you just the way we are. And that is what David is understanding. And he goes to the final part of the psalm, which is very similar to his conclusion of Psalm 19. Because when he contemplates God, his almighty power, the fact that he's everywhere, the fact that he knows everything, he can only surrender to God. Because that's what it demands from us. If we meet such a God, that's what it immediately demands from us. Surrender. God's, as I call it, omnipurity, or the all-holy God. God judges everything because God is holy. And that he understands. So one could, and some people ask, are the evils also planned by God? Some people might conclude that. Is that really what David is saying? Only God is perfect, is what he's saying. Only God has full knowledge, full power, and full presence. He is holy and he is perfect. And because that amazing presence of God is what it is, he demands that you and I should be holy too. And that would be impossible. He knew it. In the time he lived before Christ, there was only one way, and it was prescribed by keeping the law. And the law itself was a cycle of non-ending sacrifice, because every year it had to be renewed. Because every time a firstborn was born, every time somebody did this or did that, they had to shed blood, because it was the only price that was acceptable in their understanding to abide in the presence of God. That's why that hint from Psalm 19 is so important, because David is looking and he knows, he looks ahead, and he has the promise into his bloodline that a Redeemer will be born. And he could he could only hope for this. And he could only just bring himself in repentance constantly before God until Christ is revealed. And when Christ is finally revealed, you and I hit the jackpot, to call it or put it somehow. It is possible then for you and for me that sanctification that is demanded from us, and he knows is impossible for us, he himself provides it. And he gives us Jesus, so that through the implication, that word that is today so much in the news, with all these people going through courts and things, is imputed, is put onto you. It is his righteousness that is applied to us, so that we, through his work, can be holy like He is. So that because the believer must not only do away with sin, but he must discern and hate sin like God does. And that's a hard ask for a human being. But that is what we live today. The coming, like Jesus invites us, He says, come to me. Just confess. Just come to me and I will redeem you. Because my redemption is the last act of sacrifice that was needed. It's enough. The debt is paid. So we as church, we are called to hate the sin, but love the sinner. That's the work of the church today. And we must not forget, Paul reminds us in that phrase, so easy to remember, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And that must be our message to those outside the church, to those still looking to find sense to their lives. So David arrives into his final prayer as he closes his psalm. The final prayer is a natural response for one who has caught the glimpse of God's glory, God's majesty and understanding of who He is. So the result of this discovery is that David falls on his knees before God, the omniscient, after having seen and experienced His presence all along his life, marveled at His omnipotence and realized that he needs God for his everyday. So when we can finally understand as God understands, think His thoughts after Him, not only about His great creation, but even about our own sinfulness and the need, daily need that we have for His salvation, and is then and only then that we truly are leading or being led by God in the way everlasting. That is the goal of the church. That is the goal for each one of us. That every day we could grow a little bit in this direction. And Paul says it later on, and he explains we live in the here or in the now, but not quite yet. So we live in this, trapped in this world where we can see salvation, we can see the Lord for who He is, we can see what He offers, and yet we still live in these bodies of ours that even though they've been so marvelously created, they have tendencies that we find very difficult to harness. This psalm, it just goes through David's life, and out of all this experience, his conclusion is the same. I need God. I've been a king. I've been a warrior. I've etc., etc., etc. I'm still at the same place. I still desperately need God in my day-to-day. So trust that the meditation of this psalm has been helpful to you, certainly helpful to me, in bringing perspective into who really I am and how much I need Him in the day-to-day basis. So we can help each other, we can as church support each other, and we can bless each other. I like us to sing together, to finish, and bless each other. Because it is, remember this idea, I mentioned it before, our words go out. And the belief in the Jewish mind is that words do have an actual life in themselves and that are able to do their job. So let's bless each other, knowing that we can truly bless each other and that our words will do the job into each one of us for at least this week. If you want to stand up and give a bit of a rest to the seats, we can just bless each other.